I still remember that day like it happened yesterday. It wasn't just another morning or another event in my life. It was one of those moments that hits you so hard you can feel it in your bones forever. My father had always been a man of immense wealth, someone the city whispered about with a mix of respect and fear. He owned everything, from grand houses to fast cars, and the kind of influence that made people both admire and envy him. But for me, growing up in that world of luxury, it never felt perfect. There was a silence in the hallways that laughter couldn't fill, a sense that everything had a price, even kindness. And yet, even in that suffocating environment, I had learned to notice the little things, the people who worked quietly behind the scenes, whose value was never measured by money or status. The day that changed everything started like any other, with the mansion buzzing quietly with anticipation. But there was tension too, thick and heavy, the kind that made the air feel almost solid. My father had called a meeting, and it wasn't just any meeting. It was about something that seemed trivial to most, but to us, it was monumental. My younger brother was about to make a choice that everyone in our circle had been speculating about for months. He was going to choose a mother, not in the abstract way we usually think about family, but in a very real, public, and frankly, shocking way. My father had invited the city's socialites, the women with elegance, status, and everything our world seemed to value, to this grand hall. Each one had prepared herself as though she were auditioning for something bigger than herself, and everyone expected the predictable, that my brother, a child no older than 10, would pick the richest, the most glamorous, the one who fit our family image perfectly. But the moment I watched him, standing there in the center of all the care, at glitter and expectation, I realized he was different. While the socialites fluttered around him, offering smiles, gifts, and attention, his eyes didn't wander to the jewels or the designer dresses. He wasn't impressed by what everyone else worshipped. Instead, he looked somewhere else, somewhere no one was noticing. He saw the maid, not the glamorous guests, not the ones who represented wealth and prestige, but her. She stood quietly in the corner, as she always did, her hands folded, her head slightly bowed, doing her work with careful precision. She didn't demand attention, and yet she had a presence that pulled at the heart in a way no gold necklace ever could. I could see it, the recognition, the understanding between them that seemed to transcend everything else in the room. As the socialites leaned in, whispering and adjusting their gowns, I felt the tension grow. It was palpable, like a storm about to break. Every eye in the room was on him, waiting for the expected choice. They didn't understand that he had always been able to see beyond the surface. While adults in the room measured people by their wealth and social standing, he measured them by something far more profound, their heart. And that's when I realized, with a mix of awe and fear, that this choice would shake our family and the world around us in ways I could never have imagined. He stepped forward, slowly, deliberately. My pulse quickened, my chest tightened. Every socialite stiffened, expecting him to follow the rules of our world, the invisible laws of wealth and power that had governed our lives for generations. My father, normally so commanding, seemed caught off guard, his usual confidence faltering as he watched his son make a decision that no one had dared anticipate. The silence was so thick you could have heard a pin drop. And then it happened. The choice that would ripple through our liet, theirs like a tidal wave. He walked toward the maid. Not a single glance at the socialites. Not a flicker of hesitation. The collective gasp from the room was immediate, and it felt like the walls themselves were vibrating with disbelief. I could feel it too, the shock, the anger, the disbelief. And yet, beneath it all, there was something else. A kind of quiet, stubborn hope. She looked up at him, her eyes wide, heart racing, aware of the scrutiny that had always ignored her before. And even though I was terrified of what my father might say, what the socialites would whisper, I couldn't help but feel proud of my brother. He had seen something that everyone else had missed, something invaluable, her humanity, her courage, her honesty. And in that moment, I understood that this wasn't just about a child choosing a person. It was about challenging the rules of a world that often rewarded the wrong things. The air was electric, every second stretching longer than it should. My father's voice finally broke the silence, trembling with the weight of disbelief and authority. "Are you sure?" he asked, though I already knew the answer. He nodded, calm and certain, and I could feel the tension in the room tighten even more. Socialites whispered behind their hands, their faces pale and their confidence shaken. They hadn't expected a child to defy them. They hadn't expected a choice so pure and honest. And I realized then that our world, so obsessed with appearances, had no way to process what had just happened. It was a turning point, not just for him or the maid, but for all of us. The world we had known, one built on wealth, status, and careful appearances, was suddenly cracking, revealing truths no one had acknowledged before. I watched as the maid's eyes filled with emotion, a mixture of fear and disbelief, and yet also hope. She had been invisible for so long, overlooked by everyone except those who truly saw her. And now, in a single moment, she was seen, really seen. And even as my heart pounded, and the room seemed to hold its breath, I realized something else. This choice, this simple act of courage and clarity, was a lesson about what truly matters, about seeing beyond the surface, about recognizing the strength and value in those whom the world ignores. It was a challenge to everything we had been taught to believe, a reminder that sometimes the heart knows what the eyes cannot see. And as I looked around, at the stunned faces, at my father, at the socialites, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Who would have thought that a child's choice could shake the foundations of a world built on wealth and appearances? Who would have imagined that in the quietest corner of our lives, someone so unnoticed could suddenly become the center of everything? And yet, there it was, unfolding before my eyes, raw and real, a story of courage, honesty, and the quiet power of the heart. The moment he walked toward her, I could feel the air shift. It was as if the entire room had stopped breathing, caught in that suspended instant between disbelief and inevitability. The socialites, who had spent weeks preparing their smiles, their poses, their carefully rehearsed gestures, suddenly froze. Their glittering gowns and sparkling jewelry didn't matter anymore. Every eye was on the boy, on the maid, on the decision that had overturned everything we had always believed. Even my father, usually a man of unshakable control, looked lost, as if the ground itself had vanished beneath him. I could see the tension coiling through the room like an electric current. The socialites whispered, leaning toward one another, their eyes darting between him and her. "How could he? This isn't possible. She can't be chosen." Their voices were hushed, but the weight of judgment hung over us all, thick and suffocating. And yet, the boy didn't flinch. He stood there, calm and deliberate. Every step he took toward her carrying a certainty that seemed impossible for someone so young. I wanted to reach out and steady him, But I also knew he didn't need it. He had already made up his mind, and nothing in the world, neither wealth nor power, neither expectation nor fear, could sway him. The maid, of course, noticed the eyes on her. She felt every whispered comment, every flicker of judgment, but she didn't run. Her hands, slightly trembling, remained folded in front of her. Her chest rose and fell, as if she were trying to steady herself against the storm that had suddenly landed in that grand hall. I could see it in her eyes. Fear, yes, but also something braver than I had ever witnessed. A quiet strength, the kind that comes from being overlooked for years and learning to survive without recognition. I felt my own chest tighten, because I knew that in that moment, she was not just standing up for herself. She was standing for all the people who had been dismissed, ignored, or underestimated their entire lives. My father cleared his throat, a sharp sound that cut through the room, demanding attention. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice firm, but tinged with something I couldn't quite name. Was it disbelief, fear, or maybe even awe? The boy nodded, his small face set in determination. And then came the gasp, a collective, audible gasp from every corner of the room. I felt it in my own chest, that sharp rush of shock and adrenaline, because this was no longer just a choice about a child or a maid. It had become a confrontation with every rule, every expectation, every assumption we had lived under for years. The socialites, their perfectly manicured hands now useless, recoiled as if struck. Some tried to regain composure, forcing their smiles into place. But it was too late. The energy in the room had shifted irreversibly. I watched as they whispered to one another, their confidence shaking, realizing that the child had seen something they couldn't, something more valuable than wealth, more permanent than titles, more true than appearances. And I realized that even my father, a man who had always been untouchable, who had built an empire on his own rules, was being forced to acknowledge it too. There was a sudden silence, heavy with expectation, as if the world itself were holding its breath. And then the murmurs started, small at first, almost accidental, then louder, more desperate. Questions hung in the air. Why would he choose her? What did she have that none of the others did? How could this be allowed? And yet, beneath the whispers, I sensed another current, an almost imperceptible ripple of respect, a quiet recognition of honesty and courage. The maid had no words, but her presence alone said more than any explanation could. She had earned the right to be seen, not through wealth or charm, but through something the world had long forgotten to value: integrity, patience, and quiet strength. I glanced at my brother, standing there with that calm certainty that had always unnerved adults. Even as whispers and glares swirled around him, he remained unfazed. He had chosen not out of rebellion, not out of spite, but out of instinct, intuition, and an understanding that people are more than the masks they wear. He had seen her heart when no one else had, and he had trusted it above the glittering illusion of power and privilege. I felt a surge of pride for him, mixed with fear of what would come next. How would my father react? How would the women in the room respond? And how would the rest of the world view this defiance of expectation? The tension in the room became almost unbearable. Every movement, every glance, every breath seemed to stretch into eternity. The socialites whispered among themselves, unsure whether to confront him or retreat. My father, usually a figure of control, seemed caught in a storm of emotions: shock, anger, and slowly, something softer, like reluctant admiration. I could see it flicker in his eyes. The realization that maybe, just maybe, the heart sees truths the eyes cannot. And then it happened. The boy reached her side, his small hand extended not in arrogance, not in theatrics, but in genuine recognition. She hesitated for a split second, overwhelmed by the attention, by the disbelief, by the weight of history pressing down on her. But then she took his hand, and in that simple gesture, the room shifted again. It was quiet, almost imperceptible, but it was undeniable. Something had changed. The invisible walls of status, wealth, and expectation had begun to crack. And in that moment, I felt the truth settle over me like a tidal wave. Courage, honesty, and heart could defy even the strongest forces of society. The room was tense, but a new energy had begun to flow. Whispers still lingered, but they were accompanied by something else. Curiosity, awe, and, in some corners, grudging respect. The choice had set a chain reaction. People who had dismissed her suddenly had to recognize her, whether they wanted to or not. My father, ever the strategist, now faced a new challenge, accepting that life, love, and loyalty are not dictated by wealth alone. And I realized, with a mixture of fear and hope, that this day was only the beginning. This was no longer just a child choosing a mother. It was a lesson, a challenge, and a revelation all at once. And as I watched my brother and the maid, hand in hand, standing in the center of a world that had ignored her for far too long, I knew one thing with certainty. Everything had changed, and nothing would ever be the same again. The moment had arrived when everything, every expectation, every whispered rule of our world came crashing down. The room was silent, but the silence was heavy, charged with disbelief and tension. Everyone was staring, socialites frozen in place, my father's jaw tight, his usually commanding presence faltering. It was as if time itself had stopped, holding its breath in awe and shock. And in the middle of it all, my brother stood tall, his hand still extended toward the maid, steady and unwavering. I could feel my own heart pounding. My pulse raced. My hands trembled slightly as I watched the scene unfold. No one had predicted this. Not my father, not the socialites, not even I had imagined the magnitude of what was happening. They had all assumed he would follow the rules, the expectations, the world of glitter and status that had shaped our lives for generations. But he hadn't. He had looked past the gowns, the jewels, and the titles, and chosen her, the maid. The collective gasp swept through the room like a tidal wave. "She can't be. How could he?" whispered one socialite, her voice trembling with disbelief. Others covered their mouths, eyes wide, unable to comprehend the choice that had just shattered their assumptions. And yet, amid the shock and murmurs, I could sense something else stirring. A quiet, almost imperceptible shift, a ripple of truth passing through the room. My father stepped forward, voice firm but shaking, a mix of authority, confusion, and something I hadn't seen in years, astonishment. "Are you sure?" he demanded, the weight of expectation pressing down on him. The boy nodded calmly, almost solemnly. No hesitation, no doubt, just certainty. And in that certainty, the room seemed to quake. The walls, the chandeliers, the grand tapestries, it all felt like it had been holding its breath for this exact moment. The maid looked up at him, her eyes wide, her chest rising and falling with a mix of fear and disbelief. She had spent years unnoticed, invisible in a world that prized appearances over character. She had never asked for recognition, never sought praise, yet here she was, in the center of the most powerful room in the city, chosen not for wealth or status, but for something deeper. Honesty, loyalty, and a heart that had always been true. I could see her trembling slightly, but there was also a spark in her eyes, a quiet courage that seemed to shine brighter than any diamond in the room. And then the whispers began to grow, spreading like wildfire. Why would he choose her? This isn't possible. She doesn't belong here. Some voices were harsh, judgmental, dripping with disbelief. Others were softer, curious, even admiring, but they all carried the same shock. The balance of power in that room, carefully curated for decades, had just been upended by the choice of a child. And I realized, with a chill running down my spine, that the consequences would stretch far beyond this day, beyond this room, and into the lives of everyone present. My father's eyes softened, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something human. Respect, perhaps, or maybe awe. He had built his life on wealth and influence, believing that power alone could command loyalty and admiration. But here, in the center of that grand hall, he had no control. He could not command her, he could not command my brother, and he could not command the truth that had just been revealed. The choice had stripped away illusions, exposing the reality that no amount of money could fabricate. Some things cannot be bought, and some hearts cannot be ignored. The room felt almost electric. Every glance, every subtle movement, every muffled gasp carried weight. I could see the socialites glancing at one another, uncertain how to react. Their confidence had been shaken. They had assumed the child would follow the rules, the world's unwritten hierarchy. But he hadn't. And in that rebellion, in that pure, untainted decision, he had revealed something stronger than wealth, stronger than prestige, stronger than tradition itself. The maid's hand trembled as she finally accepted his, and in that instant, the room seemed to shift. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was undeniable. Something fundamental had changed. The invisible walls that separated privilege from service, wealth from honesty, appeared. Says from heart. They all wavered, cracked, and in some places collapsed entirely. And I felt a mix of awe and relief, because I knew the world, even for just a moment, had been forced to recognize the truth. I glanced at my brother. There was no arrogance, no sense of victory in his eyes, only calm certainty. He had seen what no one else had dared to notice, that character and courage outweigh wealth, and that the heart has its own way of seeing what the eyes cannot. I felt a swell of pride and fear, because the ripples of his choice were only beginning. How would the world react? Would my father accept it fully? Would the socialites ever forgive this affront to their expectations? And what did it mean for everyone else? The ones who had been overlooked, judged, or underestimated their entire lives. And in that charged silence, I realized something even deeper. This wasn't just about one child choosing a maid. It was about exposing the invisible hierarchies, the subtle injustices, the walls of prejudice that society builds and maintains. It was about reminding everyone, quietly but powerfully, that the world is not always fair, but that courage, honesty, and integrity have the power to challenge it. As I watched them standing there, hand in hand, I knew the story was far from over. But for that moment, in the stillness, in the awe, in the shock, something undeniable had been revealed. The heart sees what the eyes cannot, and sometimes that is enough to change everything. The question hung in the air, heavy and electric. Could honesty and courage truly outweigh a world built on power and appearances? The answer was waiting to unfold, and I could feel it, deep in my bones, that the next moments would decide everything. After that moment, the room slowly began to exhale, though the weight of what had happened lingered like a storm cloud. Socialites shifted uncomfortably, trying to regain composure, but their whispers carried disbelief and awe at the same time. My father, who had always carried himself with unshakable authority, finally stepped back and exhaled, as if he had been holding his breath for a lifetime. His eyes, which moments ago had been sharp and commanding, now softened with a mix of astonishment and something else, perhaps pride, perhaps understanding. He realized what everyone else had failed to see. The boy had chosen with clarity and courage, seeing beyond the glitter and the expectations, recognizing what truly mattered. The maid, once invisible, now stood in the center of attention. Her hands, which had labored quietly for years, now rested lightly in my brother's small grip. She blinked, taking in the room, the stunned faces, the incredulity, and the recognition that had been long denied. I could see fear, yes, but also relief and an almost tentative hope. It was as if she had been waiting for this acknowledgement her whole life, and now it had arrived in the most unlikely form, a child's choice that defied everything the world had taught us to believe. I couldn't help but feel a rush of emotion myself. Pride, because my brother had been brave enough to follow his heart. Fear, because the ripples of this moment would spread far beyond the walls of this room, reaching people who had never imagined such a choice could be made. And awe, because in that single act, a quiet revolution had begun. It was more than just a decision about a mother. It was a statement about humanity, honesty, and courage, forcing everyone present to confront their assumptions about worth and value. My father finally spoke, his voice firm but calm. Perhaps I underestimated what you can see, he admitted, looking at my brother and then at the maid. There was no anger now, only a reluctant acknowledgement that the choice was right, even if it had defied the rules of a world he had built on wealth and appearances. And in that mission, a lesson emerged, not just for him, but for all of us. True worth isn't measured by money, status, or title. It's measured by character, integrity, and the courage to act according to what is right, not what is expected. The room remained tense, but the energy began to shift. Whispers of disbelief gave way to murmurs of reflection. Even the socialites, who had once believed themselves untouchable, had to reckon with a truth they had ignored for too long. That truth was simple, but radical. People matter more than possessions. Heart matters more than appearances. And honesty carries a weight no wealth can ever buy. The maid, who had always been unseen, now embodied that truth, standing quietly yet powerfully in the middle of a world that had ignored her for so long. As I watched them, I realized this story wasn't just about a choice or even about a family. It was a reflection of the world we live in, a world that often overlooks the quiet, the humble, the kind, and the strong, rewarding only what glitters on the surface. And yet, it was also a reminder that courage, integrity, and the ability to see truth beyond appearances can change everything. A single act, a single choice, has the power to challenge the assumptions, prejudices, and injustices that are woven into our lives. My brother looked up at the maid, a small smile tugging at his lips. She smiled back, shyly, almost disbelievingly, as if the world had finally acknowledged her value. And in that simple, quiet exchange, I felt the full impact of the day. This was more than a victory for her. It was a victory for anyone who had ever been overlooked, dismissed, or underestimated. It was a lesson that courage and honesty will always shine through, even in the face of disbelief, judgment, or tradition. I still remember thinking, in that charged, silent moment, that this story would stay with me forever. It was a lesson I would carry, one that had unfolded before my eyes with shocking clarity. Wealth and status are fleeting, but integrity, heart, and courage are eternal. It was proof that the world is not always fair, but that fairness can be claimed by those brave enough to see it, recognize it, and act upon it. And so, as the room gradually returned to life, I asked myself, and now I ask you, how often do we overlook those who quietly carry strength, dignity, and truth simply because they don't fit the world's expectations? How often do we fail to see the heart beneath the surface, the courage beneath the silence? And most importantly, are we willing to challenge our own assumptions, to recognize the truth, and to act with integrity, even when it defies what society expects? This story isn't just about one boy, one maid, or one powerful family. It's about all of us. It's about the choices we make, the assumptions we question, and the courage it takes to follow our hearts. And as I tell it now, I hope it reminds you, like it reminded me, that the smallest, simplest acts of honesty and courage can shake even the strongest foundations, revealing a world that is better, fairer, and truer than we ever imagined. Even after the initial shock faded, the room felt different. Lighter in some ways, heavier in others. The socialites, once poised and unshakable, had retreated to corners, whispering to themselves, trying to understand what had just happened. My father, who had spent his life commanding respect and influence, now stood quietly, absorbing a truth he had long ignored. The heart could see what power and wealth never could. I watched him, wondering how long it would take for him to fully accept it, and realizing that even for him, acceptance was a journey, not an instant. The maid, whose life had always been one of quiet labor and unseen service, now stood in the center of attention. She had never sought recognition, never expected admiration, yet here it was, unavoidable and undeniable. And though she appeared composed, I could see the flared utter of emotion in her eyes, the disbelief, the fear, the hope, and finally, the subtle, steady glow of pride. My brother held her hand, small but firm, as if to say, I see you, I trust you, I choose you. And in that simple gesture, something powerful shifted, something that could never be erased. Over the next hours, the tension slowly dissolved, replaced by murmurs of reflection. People who had come expecting spectacle and performance were instead confronted with authenticity and courage. The room, once filled with whispers of judgment and anticipation, now hummed with a different energy. Awe, respect, and the subtle understanding that a child's honesty had revealed the truth of what mattered most. It was a quiet revolution, invisible yet palpable, leaving its mark on everyone who had witnessed it. I couldn't help but reflect on what this meant beyond the walls of that mansion. This wasn't just a story about a family or a choice. It was about all of us. It was about the countless people who are overlooked, underestimated, or dismissed every single day, simply because they don't fit the world's narrow expectations. How many hearts are ignored? How many acts of courage go unseen? And how often do we fail to recognize truth when it is staring us in the face? And yet, the boy had reminded us that recognition doesn't always come from status or wealth. It comes from insight, empathy, and the courage to act on what we know to be right. I thought about the maid's life before that day, of all the years she had labored without acknowledgement, unseen, except by those who truly noticed. And now, with a single choice, she had been elevated, not by money or title, but by honesty and integrity, qualities so often invisible, yet so profoundly powerful. It was a reminder that every person, no matter how overlooked, carries value, and that sometimes it takes a child's clear vision to reveal what the world has long ignored. As the evening progressed, I realized the lesson wasn't just for those in that room. It was for me, for everyone watching, for anyone who has ever doubted themselves or been doubted by others. Life often rewards the glittering, the loud, the visible, but true worth is quieter, steadier, and infinitely more powerful. It waits for someone brave enough to see it, acknowledge it, and honor it. And in that acknowledgement, it changes lives, not just for the one being recognized, but for everyone around them. I watched my brother and the maid again, hand in hand, and felt a surge of hope. Their connection wasn't about wealth, social status, or appearances. It was about trust, recognition, and seeing the humanity in someone else. And it struck me that this was the real lesson of that day. The heart knows truths that the eyes cannot, and courage can break through barriers that tradition, expectation, or fear might build. It was a quiet, revolutionary act that would ripple far beyond the walls of our home, far beyond our family, touching anyone willing to pay attention. And as I tell you this story now, I want you to pause and reflect. How often do we miss what is right in front of us, distracted by glitter and noise, by appearances and status? How often do we fail to recognize courage and honesty simply because it doesn't wear a crown or a designer dress? And most importantly, are we brave enough to act when we finally see it? To trust our instincts, our hearts, and the truth that cannot be bought or commanded? That day, my brother taught me something I will never forget. He reminded me that courage is not always loud, that power is not always visible, and that even the smallest among us can make the biggest difference. And the maid, whose life had been overlooked for so long, became a living testament to the fact that integrity, patience, and strength will always shine through, then when the world tries to ignore them. So, when you walk through life and notice someone unseen, someone overlooked, or someone underestimated, remember this story. Remember the child who chose heart over wealth, honesty over appearances, and human connection over status. Remember that the quiet, courageous acts we witness or commit have the power to change lives, to challenge assumptions, and to reveal a truth far greater than anything money or power can offer. And I leave you with this. How many times have we ignored what matters most? How many opportunities to see, honor, and act with courage have we let slip by? And if we are brave enough, what might happen if we finally choose differently? If we follow our hearts, like my brother did, and recognize what is real, what is true, and what is worthy of being seen. Because sometimes, that one choice, that one act of courage can change everything.
Think about it. Could this happen to you? Some stories aren't just heard, they're felt. Behind every truth, there's a hidden fear. This story won't just shake your mind, it'll haunt your soul. Who could imagine the truth would be this terrifying? The story ends, but the questions stay alive.